Both on this old house and the new Yankee Workshop for years, we have always promoted safety in all aspects of what we do, but most importantly, in eye protection.
In the swamps south of Orlando, a biology professor picked up a dead pygmy rattlesnake for a routine dissection, and something crawled out of its mouth. Not maggots, not ants. Small, pale, worm-like creatures, still moving, still alive, coming out of a snake that had been dead for less than a day. He had never seen anything like it in 20 years of field work. And when he sent the specimens off for identification, the answer that came back explained a story far stranger than anyone in Florida wanted to admit. People online love to joke about Florida. The memes write themselves, a state that seems to specialize in chaos, in wildlife nobody asked for, in headlines that sound fake until you check and they are not. So when whispers started spreading that something in Florida was releasing thousands of creatures capable of killing snakes from the inside, the reaction was exactly what you'd expect. Laughter, skepticism, comment sections full of people assuming it was another exaggerated internet rumor about the most chaotic state in America. Surely nobody would deliberately unleash thousands of parasites into the wild. Surely this was fiction dressed up as news. Except it wasn't fiction. And it wasn't really a decision either. What actually happened in Florida's wetlands over the past 3 decades is stranger, messier, and far more consequential than any exaggerated headline could capture. And understanding it means understanding one of the most quietly destructive invasions happening in North America right now. To understand why this story sounds so absurd on the surface, you have to start with the animal that made it possible in the first place, the Burmese python. Burmese pythons are not supposed to exist in Florida. They are native to Southeast Asia, and for decades they were popular in the American exotic pet trade because hatchlings are small, cheap, and easy to sell. The problem is that Burmese pythons don't stay small. A snake bought as an 18-inch hatchling can grow into a 16-foot, 150-pound predator within a few years, and plenty of owners discovered that fact the hard way. Some pythons were deliberately released when they became too large to manage. Others escaped. And in August of 1992, Hurricane Andrew tore through South Florida and destroyed a python breeding facility near Miami, scattering an unknown number of snakes into the surrounding wetlands along with everything else the storm displaced. Whatever the exact combination of causes, by the early 2000s, Burmese pythons were breeding successfully in the Everglades. And once they were established, biologists began noticing something strange happening to Florida's native snake population, something that had nothing to do with pythons eating anything. Native snakes were turning up dead with no obvious cause. No predator wounds. No vehicle strikes. No signs of disease that matched anything in the textbooks. And when researchers finally cut a few of them open, they found the answer waiting inside the lungs. The organisms responsible are called pentostomes, and despite the nickname that eventually stuck to them, snake lungworm, they aren't actually worms at all. Genetically, pentostomes are crustaceans, distant and deeply strange relatives of crabs and shrimp that evolved into parasites so specialized they barely resemble anything in that family anymore. The specific species behind Florida's outbreak is called Raelietiella orientalis, and it is native to Asia, where it has spent millions of years coexisting with Asian snake species, including the Burmese python. That coexistence is the entire key to this story. In its home range, R. orientalis and the Burmese python evolved together. The python's immune system knows how to tolerate the parasite. It can carry a lung infestation without it becoming a death sentence. But when Burmese pythons arrived in Florida, they didn't arrive alone. They brought their parasites with them, and those parasites found themselves surrounded by an entirely new population of hosts that had never encountered anything like this before in their evolutionary history: Florida's native snakes. Researchers first detected the parasite in South Florida snakes sometime between 2004 and 2006, though it took years of genetic sequencing before anyone connected the dots and confirmed where it had come from. The life cycle explains how something living inside a python in the Everglades could end up inside a rattlesnake hundreds of miles away. An infected python sheds parasite eggs in its waste. A cockroach eats that waste and picks up the eggs. A frog or lizard eats the cockroach, and the larval parasite settles inside that intermediate host, waiting. Then a native snake eats the frog or the lizard, and the parasite finally reaches the place it needs to be: the lungs, where it matures, feeds on blood, and lays the next generation of eggs. It's an efficient, almost elegant delivery system, and it means the parasite doesn't need direct contact with a python at all to keep spreading. It just needs Florida's ordinary food chain to keep functioning the way it always has, which it does every day, all over the state. Here's the part that separates this from a minor nuisance and turns it into a genuine ecological threat. Native Florida snakes have no built-in defenses against this parasite, because they never needed any. Burmese pythons had millions of years to develop tolerance. Black racers, coachwhips, pygmy rattlesnakes, and eastern indigo snakes had zero. When the parasite settles into the lungs of a species that never evolved alongside it, the infection tends to be far more severe. The pentastomes feed on blood inside the lung tissue, and a heavy infestation can leave a snake anemic and struggling to breathe, a slow suffocation happening from within its own body. Some snakes survive lighter infections. Many don't, and because snakes spend most of their lives hidden from view, under logs, in burrows, tangled in palmetto scrub, a dead or dying snake rarely gets discovered by a person who would think to report it. Scientists studying this outbreak have been candid about a frustrating reality of their work. An animal this secretive means the true death toll is almost certainly undercounted, because most of it is simply never seen. What researchers have confirmed is still alarming enough. As of recent surveys, the parasite has been documented in at least 19 of Florida's 46 native snake species. It started in the Everglades but has not stayed there. Studies have tracked its spread into central Florida, including populations hundreds of miles north of where it first appeared, at wildlife refuges well outside the traditional python range. Scientists tracking its progress describe a pattern of steady, relentless expansion northward, and they warn that nothing about the parasite's biology suggests it's going to stop at Florida's border. It can apparently tolerate cold snaps as long as its host provides some shelter, and researchers expect it to eventually reach neighboring states across the southeast. It's worth slowing down on exactly how a parasite goes from infecting a handful of pythons in one corner of the Everglades to showing up in 19 different native species scattered across half the state, because the mechanics of it explain why nobody was able to stop this before it spread. Pentastomes don't jump directly from snake to snake. There's no bite, no direct contact required at all. The entire system depends on Florida's food web doing exactly what it normally does. A python sheds eggs. A cockroach, going about its ordinary business, eats something contaminated with those eggs. A frog or a small lizard eats the cockroach, as frogs and lizards do constantly, without any awareness that they've just become a carrier. And then a native snake, a black racer hunting along a fence line, a rattlesnake ambushing prey near a burrow, eats that frog or lizard as an entirely normal meal, and picks up the parasite in the process. Nothing about that chain is unusual or rare. Roaches, frogs, and lizards are some of the most abundant animals in Florida, which means the parasite has an almost limitless number of pathways available to reach new hosts. Researchers studying the outbreak have pointed out that this is precisely what makes it so difficult to contain. You can't vaccinate a cockroach population. You can't fence off a frog. The parasite is essentially riding on the back of the ordinary Florida ecosystem, using its own abundance and complexity as a highway. That also explains the timeline. From the first detections in South Florida snakes around 2004 to 2006, it took less than 2 decades for the parasite to be documented at a wildlife refuge north of Daytona Beach, hundreds of miles from where it started. To researchers who study invasive species for a living, that speed is what set off alarm bells. Most invasive parasites take generations to expand their range that far. This one did it inside a single human lifetime, moving north roughly as fast as researchers could keep sampling for it. Anytime a story involves a parasite crawling out of a dead animal, the question that inevitably follows is whether it poses any risk to humans, and it's a fair question to ask before dismissing this as purely a snake problem. The honest, current answer from researchers is that there's no confirmed evidence our Orientalis can infect humans, and its life cycle is specifically built around reptile hosts rather than mammals. Pentastomes as a broader group do include some species capable of infecting humans in other parts of the world, typically through contaminated food or water in regions where certain reptiles are eaten or handled without precautions, which is part of why scientists haven't ruled out the possibility entirely and continue to monitor it as research progresses. For now, though, the documented damage is limited to Florida's reptile population, and public health officials have not issued any warnings tied to this specific parasite. It's a snake disease, spread through a food chain built for snakes, and there's no indication that's about to change. Still, the uncertainty is part of why researchers keep pushing for more funding and more data. Because the honest scientific answer to could this ever affect people is currently probably not, but we haven't studied it long enough to be completely certain, and that's not the kind of answer that makes for a reassuring headline. So where did the idea come from that Florida deliberately released these creatures? That part of the story says less about wildlife biology and more about how information travels once it leaves a research paper and enters the internet. What actually happened is that Florida wildlife agencies, universities, and independent researchers began publicizing the parasite's spread specifically because they wanted the public's help. A biologist at the University of Central Florida built a citizen science network asking ordinary people to report dead snakes they came across, so researchers could track the infection's reach without needing an army of field biologists to search every wetland in the state themselves. That's a common, sensible approach to studying something this widespread. But headlines built around worms found inside dead snakes and parasites spreading across Florida travel fast. And somewhere between the original science reporting and the algorithm-driven content that reposts and reframes it, nuance tends to get sanded away. A parasite that arrived accidentally, as an unintended hitchhiker on an invasive species, got flattened in retelling into something that sounds like a deliberate government release program. It's an understandable leap for anyone skimming a headline rather than reading the study, especially given Florida's well-earned reputation for wildlife stories that sound too strange to be real. But it's also, plainly, not what happened. Nobody in a lab coat signed off on unleashing thousands of parasitic crustaceans into the Everglades on purpose. There was no press conference, no funding proposal, no wildlife agency decision behind any of it. The truth is less like a conspiracy and more like an accident that's been quietly compounding for 30 years. If this had been a deliberate release, there would at least be a satisfying villain, a decision-maker to blame, someone whose judgment could be second-guessed after the fact. What actually happened is messier and, in some ways, more unsettling because it means nobody is really in control of the outcome. The Burmese python invasion itself has already reshaped the Everglades in ways that were almost unimaginable before it started. Studies tracking mammal populations in areas with heavy python presence have documented steep, sometimes catastrophic declines in raccoons, opossums, rabbits, and other small mammals that used to be common sights along Everglades roads at night. Pythons capable of swallowing deer and even young alligators have effectively rewritten the food web from the top down. The lungworm parasite is, in a strange sense, a second invasion riding on the back of the first one. An indirect consequence nobody planned for, discovered only because a handful of researchers happened to notice something wrong when they looked closely enough. That's often how ecological disasters actually unfold. Not with a single dramatic announcement, but with a slow accumulation of small, easy-to-miss signals. A dead snake here, a strange worm there, a pattern that only becomes visible once enough data points get compared side by side. The scientists working on this problem describe it less as a crisis with a clear beginning and more as a slow-motion spread they are racing to document before it reaches new states and new species they haven't even started studying yet. Once the scale of the problem became clear, Florida's answer wasn't a dramatic extermination campaign, because there isn't really a way to hunt down a microscopic parasite spreading through cockroaches, frogs, and lizards across an entire state's food chain. Instead, the response has looked a lot like the response to most modern ecological threats. Monitoring, data collection, and public awareness built slowly and mostly out of the spotlight. The citizen science network built around this parasite now includes contributions from wildlife rehabilitators, land managers, university labs, and ordinary residents who come across a dead snake in their yard or on a hiking trail and decide to report it instead of just moving on. Each report adds another data point to a map that's helping scientists understand not just where the parasite has spread, but how fast and which native species appear most vulnerable. It's unglamorous work, the kind that never generates a viral headline on its own, but it's the actual mechanism by which something like this gets understood well enough to eventually be managed. There's also been a parallel effort focused on the snakes that started this whole chain of events. Python removal programs across South Florida have paid hundreds of contracted hunters to track down and remove pythons from the Everglades, and by some counts, they have collectively eliminated tens of thousands of the invasive snakes since organized efforts began. Every python removed is, in a very literal sense, one less carrier of the parasite moving through the ecosystem and shedding eggs into the environment. It won't undo 3 decades of spread on its own, but researchers treat python removal as one of the few tools available that addresses the root of the problem rather than just the symptom. What nobody involved in this research claims is that the parasite can be eliminated entirely at this point. Once something establishes itself this thoroughly across a landscape this large, using a delivery system built on animals as common as roaches and lizards, full eradication stops being realistic. The honest goal, the one researchers actually talk about, is understanding the spread well enough to protect the species most at risk and to give other states a head start before the parasite reaches their borders too. The python removal side of the response has its own strange history, worth mentioning because it shows just how seriously Florida eventually took the broader invasion once the scale of it became impossible to ignore. What started as a small pilot program paying a couple dozen hunters an hourly wage to search the Everglades on foot has since grown into a much larger, better-funded effort involving contracted removal agents, seasonal public hunting competitions, and bounty payments tied to the size of each snake captured. Some of the state's most prolific hunters have personally removed well over 100 pythons in a single season, wrestling animals that can weigh more than the people catching them. It's slow, physically brutal work, done in heat and mud and dense brush, and it will never fully solve the underlying problem on its own. But every python taken out of the Everglades is one less animal capable of carrying the parasite into a new corner of the ecosystem, which is why researchers view the removal programs and the parasite monitoring as two halves of the same fight rather than two separate issues. Part of what makes this story worth paying attention to, beyond the shock value of the initial headline, is what it reveals about how invasive species actually cause damage. The obvious threat from an animal like the Burmese python is predation, a giant snake eating things it shouldn't be eating. That's the version of the story that gets the most attention, the viral videos, the record-breaking snake photos. But the lungworm parasite is a reminder that invasive species rarely travel alone, and the secondary consequences of an invasion can end up mattering just as much as the primary one, sometimes more, because they are harder to see coming and harder to stop once they start. A parasite that Burmese pythons could carry without much consequence has become a serious threat to species that had no reason to expect it.